DeSaulnier, you're recognized for 5 minutes, and if you're good, you get a gold star.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm still waiting for my last gold star, but I trust you. Dr. Scherholz, taken by, you alluded to John Kenneth Galbraith's Countervailing institutions, which I'm a big believer in. And so from a historical perspective, it's frustrating that we get into these arguments, and you don't have to read all of Thomas Piketty to accept that a accurate, objective analysis is there's got to be a balance. And we're not looking at, I mean, I get frustrated with free market as designed in this building, institution, that we live in a mixed market. And we've gone a long way from, people are going to get sick of me using the Eisenhower quote, where he said, at the greatest expansion period in the history of this country, or probably any economy, when we had a vibrant middle class during his administration, that he said, President Eisenhower said, only a fool would try to stop an American man or woman from attempting to organize if they choose. So I agree with the other people, it should be a choice, but we have to have these countervailing institutions. And I worry about this economy, and I agree with Mr. Moore on the purchasing power of middle-class people. But my perspective as to the causes is different, which I believe you share. So how do we deal with the inequality in terms of capital versus wages that has gotten worse in the last 3 years? That's the way I perceive President Biden's initiatives. It's not trying to empower unions for the sake of unions. You need these countervailing institutions in order to get real purchasing power up that hasn't been up since the 70s.
You said it perfectly. Like, I think of, and like when you think of an employer, the employer has inherent power over an individual worker. The employer loses the worker, it's just one worker. The worker loses, the employer loses their job. That's their livelihood. There's just an inherent imbalance of power. Things like unions, things like minimum wages provide a countervailing power to workers to create more balance, to create a fairer and stronger growing economy. But the sort of neoliberal deregulatory policies of the last 40 years have really broken that down, and we have seen the result. Skyrocketing inequality and much slower growth, because we didn't have that bottom-up, middle-out growth that really fuels strong growth. And so we can kind of we know the playbook, right? Like, to reverse the things that were undone to create the scene we're in now. So raise the minimum wage, raise overtime protection, change labor laws so workers who want to join a union are able to join a union, and on and on and on. Those things will make a massive difference. And
for the middle class and for consumers, I'm sorry that my colleague isn't still here, but having owned small businesses for 35 years in the restaurant business that has amongst the highest mortality rates, I always looked at my employees being paid well, but I had to be competitive for people who were playing by the rules. And sometimes in California, almost a third of the small businesses were in the underground economy. So we knew that they weren't paying their sales tax. They weren't paying well, I had to compete with them. And it drove this dynamic. But my question is consistent with what Nobel Prize winning Mr. Stiglitz says. You've got to have enough money for your employees to go out and buy the product. It's the Ford rule, right? Yep. If my workers can't buy the Model T, I'm not going to be successful. So again, could you respond to that? Yep, it really is that, like, getting money in the pockets of people who are very likely to spend it, low and middle income workers, that makes our economy stronger, more resilient, faster growing. That is where we need to go from here to sort of halt and reverse some of the trends of rising inequality and weak growth that we've seen over the last 40 years. Mr. Moore, you have had some controversy in things you have said vis-a-vis labor laws. There's a lot of information. I think the New York Times or the Post is doing stories now about the tension where more and more young people are working. I won't remind you of your quote, but I could give it to you that you did at the 2016 GOP convention. How do we keep a balance here? I don't disagree with everything you say, but clearly that quote, you've got to make sure that people are protected as well. Would you care to respond to that? Well, one of the things that we were proudest of in the Trump administration was the
the record high expansion of middle class income. So median household income prior to COVID hitting, COVID changed everything. Median household income grew by $6,200, which was almost twice as much as in 8 years under Obama. So we kind of know what works. I completely agree with what you're all saying, that yes, let's build a middle class.
Mr. Moore, I was asking about the disenfranchising of the labor laws, taking away the labor laws. So I'll remind you of your quote.
Yeah.
I'm a radical on this. I'd like to have 11-year-olds be able to work.
I would defer to my colleagues. They know much more about that issue than I do. I'm not an expert on that by any means.
Artfully done. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.